Today we're going to be covering Merlin. Now, there's an awful lot of nonsense spoken about Merlin, and it really, well, frankly, annoys me. So I kind of wanted to put this story straight. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover the background, the history, the tales, the legends, and when the tales were written, why perhaps they were written, and ultimately give you some insight into the character himself. So stay tuned. I think I will start, well, at the beginning. So the word Merlin itself is a bit of a misnomer. So Merlin comes from the Welsh Merddin, which is spelt M-Y-D-D-I-N. However, the chap who wrote down the word, Mr. Geoffrey of Monmouth, more on him later, changed the word from Merlin to Merlin because he was writing in Latin and it was Merlinus instead of Merdinus. Of course, the people who would have been reading this from the Latin world, Merd being Norman French, Anglo-Norman French for the word shit, he didn't really want this character to be associated with the word poo. So yes, he swiftly changed the double D, which is the noise in Welsh, to a simple L. The origin of the name Merlin is in dispute somewhat. So there's a place in modern Wales called Carmarthen, which comes from the Welsh Caer, meaning fort or castle, and Merlin, which is Merlin, which is Merlin's court. And now it's unsure whether the name Merlin was taken from the town, or the town took the name, or I should say the location took the name from the man. What is known is that there was a guy called Merlin from the area in the North Britain, Strathclyde, called Merlin Wecht, or Mad Merlin. So on Geoffrey of Monmouth, he's broadly accepted to be the guy who really kicked off the Arthurian legend. In fact, he has such an influence on the Arthurian myth that historians generally refer to it as pre-Guilfridian and post-Guilfridian. Such was his influence. So I think it's worth looking into that man. So Geoffrey of Monmouth was a Welsh monk who wrote Historia Regum Britannia, which to this day causes quite a stir. Now, but nobody's really sure to what extent it's historical, fictitious, or just a collection of hearsay. But what we do know is that the Archdeacon of Oxford charged Geoffrey of Monmouth to go around and collect various tales from the Britons, who were pre-Saxon or pre-English Britons, so they had some sort of collection or knowledge, perhaps, of life before the conquests of the lands. So Geoffrey, being Welsh, was able to speak the language and was therefore able to go around and collect these legends and these stories from the indigenous population. So because of his position as a scholar and how people may have been cross-checking some of the facts, it's unsure whether he would have been able to completely fabricate everything. And later on I'll touch on a study that says that maybe he's more accurate than people give him credit for. But wrongly accused of falsehoods or not, it appears that he does let his imagination run a little bit wild. So this bored or creative monk, depending on your point of view I suppose, gave rise to the legend, the myths of Arthur and Merlin. The importance of Geoffrey as a Welshman, I just want to address this, is quite important. So I want you to imagine him in his position, a Welshman in a proto-Saxon, Norman-French England. Now, the Saxons had just spent several hundred years eradicating the native Welsh population from England, and then the subsequent Norman invasions had supplanted those in supremacy. So the nobility all spoke French. So the Anglo-Norman dynasties were now in the process of unifying what was left of Britain. That is to say, to conquer the last of the Britons in Wales and in southern Scotland in a kingdom called Strathclyde. So it's safe to say that the Welsh were the outsiders at the best of times. They didn't have a hereditary monarchy that favoured the eldest son, as the Saxons and Normans did. They didn't have the same laws or traditions. They had churches that predated many of those in Europe because they still existed from the Roman era. And worst of all, they didn't speak French in court, even as the Scottish did at this time. They spoke Welsh. So now you can imagine a situation where our friend Geoffrey here is probably ridiculed, bullied, outcast generally for being a Welshman, and perhaps wants to take this opportunity to big his people and his history up a little bit. maybe he has some artistic license, making certain characters appear more brave and fabulous than they actually might. And so he wrote of this character, this King Arthur, this man who saved the Britons and would return to do so again. A symbol of chivalry, nobility, and general awesomeness. And his awesome protege, Merlin, who had the power of flight. Well, not quite, but he could cast magic. He had the power of shape-shifting, knew all things from past and present, and also had the power of prophecy. Oh, and did I mention King Arthur had a magic sword and everything? Needless to say, this went down in the Brythonic kingdoms really well. The kings of Wales retold these stories with vigour. King Arthur became a proto-superhero, this mighty figure who would return and save the Britons, who these, the Welsh kings considered themselves to be, rightly, is in fact at war with the Saxons. And that was the whole ethos behind it, was this war against the invaders. Probably not very popular at the time, but we've just had the Norman invasion, so perhaps this was the right time for someone like Geoffrey to write this down rather than before that, when it would have been the Saxon kings, or Anglo-Saxon kings. Anyway, I'll save that for another time. I feel like King Arthur should be his own video. So, all fanfare aside, it does seem that Merlin would have been based on some historical figure, as I mentioned before. Some 6th century bard, perhaps. Of course, bards would have been associated with the magical word. Would he have heard the hearsay from local legends? There's also, in some of the Mabinogi and some of the branches and triads, you have Taliesin, the wizard. You have Gwydion, for instance. So there is a precedent there. But if he did exist at all, scholars generally think that it would have been from maybe the kingdom of Strathclyde, this kingdom edged up to the southern edge of Scotland, and that he was probably a Druid. It may have even been pre-Christian, if that's the case, if he was Druidic. Namely because he's described as being a Druid-like character, which, of course, Geoffrey and other monks writing this down wouldn't have really had a clue what the hell a Druid was. So the fact that they're describing it in word, and he's just a guy who does magic, coincidence, I think. So, in defence of Geoffrey, if I read you this excerpt here, a recent study, 2017, drew the conclusion that the Historia Regum Britanniae appears to contain significant, demonstrable archaeological fact. Despite being compiled many centuries after the period it describes, Geoffrey seems to have brought together a disparate mass of source material, including folklore, chronicles, king lists, dynastic tables, oral tales, and bardic praise poems, some of irrevocably garbled or corrupted in doing so. Geoffrey exercised considerable editorial control, massaging the information and smoothing out apparent inconsistencies in order to create a single grand narrative, which fed into a preferred narrative of the Norman rulers of Britain. Oh, there you go. Now you see, anything to disparage perhaps the Saxons which came before them. Interesting. And this kind of highlights for me the fact that he would have been speaking to people who maybe, of course, the oral traditions of the Britons, where the bards would tell the tales in the halls, everyone would have known. It would have been public lexicon. It wouldn't have just been halls, it would have been drinking halls, it would have been people sitting around a table, would have shared tales, and they would have had their own legends. So collecting all those different local folklores would have been a nightmare. Who knows? But apparently it's considered he did a reasonably good job. And so back to Merlin. We have effectively a bard, because he wasn't really a wizard. He had a force of charisma. He was born into the power. Bards were law masters. They were remembrancers. They expected to remember the laws and the histories of the land and consulted on serious matters. And so the Celtic people, the spoken word had power, the power to influence. So this all kind of lines up. He's a guy who has immense knowledge of the present and the past, the bard. He also has the power to influence the spoken word, the magic, the conjurer, which then later turns into the wizard as we know it now. My suspicion on this is that perhaps Merlin was fictitious, or merely came to symbolise these men of power, and was perhaps more palatable to a Christian Norman audience, which is ultimately who Geoffrey was writing for. So where does Merlin come from? Well, the origin story concerns the king Vortigern, king of the Britons, and reportedly king of Britain during the initial Saxon incursions of Kent. Vortigern is mentioned in the famous political tales of Gildas the Wise, named The Ruin of Britain, where he blames Vortigern for the fall of Britain to the Saxon barbarians. However, in this tale, Vortigern is in Gwynedd. He has fled to the northwest part of Wales, now known as Gwynedd, where he wishes to build a fort as a last line of defence against the invaders. He chooses a spot known as Dinas Emrys, which is Welsh for the Eternal City, and some of you Lord of the Rings fans may recognise the word Dinas to be very closely related to Minas, as in Minas Tirith. This is because Tolkien used a lot of the old Welsh words to make his Elvish tongue in his books. And so in the story he makes several attempts to build a fort on top of the hill that exists there. However, every time he builds above the foundation level, it falls back down to the ground. Eventually his wise men advise that only a human sacrifice will ensure that the fort can be built safely and be finished. This suggests the tale is certainly pre-Christian, as this practice was common amongst pagan civilizations, and many bones have been found in the foundations of certain important buildings and castles. The wise men tell Vortigern he must find a boy, born of no father, that is, a self-conceived mother. He must sacrifice him and place him in the foundations. Now, eventually they do find such a boy, and that boy turns out to be Merlin. He is born of no father. He has supernatural powers that no one seems to understand. They take him to Dinas Emrys for the sacrifice, at which point Merlin stops the entire proceeding by telling the king that he is mistaken. His wise men are fools and have misled him, and the actual reason that the castle keeps falling down to the ground is because beneath the hill are two slumbering giants, dragons in fact, and the building work is disturbing their slumber. And so they begin to dig, and sure enough they find two dragons, one red and one white. They had been put there to slumber, buried beneath the hill, because their war was bringing ruin to the island. The red dragon represents the Britons, and the white dragon represents the Saxons. All could see that the white dragon was far larger and much stronger, but Merlin made a prophecy on that day that the red dragon would rise again and defeat the white dragon once and for all. And to this day, the red dragon has become a symbol of Wales. It still adorns the flag, as you can see, while the white dragon was in fact a symbol of the Saxons in Germany and in fact an early flag of the English. Okay, so what did he actually get up to? Well, in early tellings he helps Uther Pendragon. Uther is King Arthur's father. Pendragon meaning chief dragon or head of the dragon in Welsh, which is the symbol of Wales in general, who fell in love with the Duke of Cornwall's wife. Now, in a moralistically ambiguous twist, Merlin changes Uther Pendragon to appear the same as the Duke, and he gets to sneak in and takes the wife for his own and sleeps with her, and then she essentially gives birth to Arthur, and so Arthur comes into the picture. Eventually, Uther Pendragon is poisoned, murdered by Saxons, and Arthur inherits the throne, in which case Merlin then becomes the guide to Arthur. So that's the kind of medieval background to it. He does find a magic sword, he does battle the Saxons, he does win, but ultimately we know he loses effectively, or if he doesn't drive them off permanently, shall we say. So it's at this stage the story takes on a life of its own. Geoffrey's created this fictitious character who represents chivalry, and he's written it in Latin, so basically everyone who can read and write in Western Europe at this time is able to read it, and the word gets out. The French, who are going through a bit of a romantic period at this time, get their hands on it, and it goes wild. Various poems and stories are written where bits are added on. And I think it's at this stage it really starts to become a fiction. it starts to actually become a legend, a myth that's told as storytelling. So almost like an early fantasy novel. King Arthur becomes a symbol of chivalry and nobility throughout Europe as people just tack on the bits that they like, especially some Christian bits about some holy grails. And with it, Merlin's powers change as well. He becomes distinctly un-druidic. He's also less of a shape-shifting master of darkness and more of an influencer, a guide, a knowledgeable speaker, a wizened man. Of course, wise man, wizard. And the whole story becomes so much more romantic. Damn French. Merlin becomes the offspring of the Antichrist in one telling, and to explain his powers. So his mother is impregnated by an incubus, or a collection of devils, or the demon. He's born and swiftly baptized, in which case his soul is saved and he's okay. However, being half demon, he has the ability to know everything all the time and the past, and some shape-shifting powers there. That's that one sorted. But God, never to be outdone, decides to give him the power of prophecy so he can also see into the future. And so all the way up to that, his powers get enhanced, they get decreased, he becomes more influential, he becomes less influential. A big thing that happens, I would say, is that he gets an antagonist in the shape of Morgan, or Vortigern, which is from the Welsh Morgan for more, which is sea, and Gen, kin of, Gen, born of, so Morgan, born of the sea. And the French add Le Féon, of the fairy. So Merlin knows she's to be his downfall, having the power of prophecy, but despite this falls madly in love with her anyway. The stories vary wildly. People just go crazy with how they want the story to be told, whether they want her to be this evil femme fatale, or whether it's just platonic. But effectively, he does teach her what he knows, and eventually she does destroy him. It's worth noting that this is a distinctly French retelling, so the French are going through a romantic phase at this time. That being that true love is overwhelming, is an irredeemably good, noble thing that can happen to you, but it's just all-consuming. If you're overtaken by love, it's what can you do? There's nothing can be done about it. And so, of course, Merlin is overcome with this, and it's his undoing in the end. And so he dies. So his burial place is rumoured to be in Carmarthen, which makes sense. Caer Merlin, Merlin's castle. There's a hill there called Bryn Merlin, which is the hill of Merlin. Other tellings, there's a glass house in Anglesey somewhere, one of the 13 wonders of. But if you wanted to go to somewhere that was related to the Arthurian legends, that's the closest thing you get to a real life area in which the name is certainly associated with it. The most modern retellings of the story have Merlin closer to a wizard, as you know. Now, without a doubt, Tolkien was influenced by the stories. Gandalf is said to be a wizard, but if you're into D&D as I am, I would argue that Gandalf is more of a bard, because he is a man who wills magic into being as a force of charisma. That said, I have no issue with Tolkien taking this into as his own. I mean, it's tastefully done. I don't think there's any real crossover other than to say that he is a wizard and Merlin was a wizard identifiably. In other retellings, you have Arthur as this Cockney geezer, or this late medieval, early Renaissance knight who's a clean-cut English public school boy who gallivants about the place looking pouty and pathetic. Now, I would say this feels more like propaganda than fantasy. I mean, King Arthur may be fictitious, but it's a bit of an insult to the myth, in my humble opinion. And call me old-fashioned, but I want my King Arthur and Merlin to be killing Saxons and fighting in a war of attrition that they can't win, travelling around the lands seeking artefacts to help them defeat their brutal foe, or at least give them a Welsh accent. Oh well, one can dream. Thanks for watching.